and to get to your point, because you were legit, the administration was legit in counter-arguing about pension payments. I started out this thinking, well, we've treated our pension payments as sort of our rainy day fund over time, but we've now built up credibility. So, fair point. We shouldn't fail to make a pension payment. I'm not advocating that. But going back to the chairman's point, if we were to simply freeze at 7/10, and I realize that would still mean we have to increase some funding to stay at 7/10, why would we not have that discussion with the rating agencies and say, look, we're going to freeze here, we're going to resume next year, we're not going to backtrack. I can't imagine the rating agencies would see it be beneficial that we're borrowing money to make the increased payment. So I guess it's twofold. Borrowing for the surplus, I can't imagine why that would be something that the rating agency would see as positive, and borrowing to make the increased payment in the pensions. When if we don't do those things, we could dramatically decrease our need for borrowing, dramatically decrease our need for the increased taxes. How do we justify doing those things?
I guess the only one comment I would answer, and then I'll leave the policy question to the treasurer, is that the borrowing pursuant to the Emergency GO Bond Act, which was passed by this chamber, the Assembly, and then signed by the governor, requires that borrowing be for specific purposes that are identified and are agreed and then are in fact approved by the Select Commission, which is made up of several representatives from both the Assembly and the Senate. And those have specific requirements. Those will be for items that are important for the social good of the state. So the specific enumeration of what the borrowing funds will be spent on as a subset of the borrowing of the budget will be in fact approved specifically by the Select Commission, and that I do not believe will cover, for example, surplus.
But it's fungible, right? I mean, come on, it's fungible. Even when you have the property tax relief funds, come on, to a great extent, even those are fungible. Let's be honest about that. And again, the Supreme Court, their finding was it's got to be COVID-related specific items or revenue hits. It's very hard to argue that the surplus is, certainly the increase in surplus. If you just shave the surplus back to what we had last year, and Treasurer, you and I have sung this song, rung this bell for years about us needing to get to a healthy surplus. It's just borrowing money to create a surplus, to me, doesn't sound healthy.
Yeah. Well, the spending plan that we submit to accompany the issuance of the bonds will comport with both the Bond Act and the Supreme Court holding. So, and on the 7/10, I was just going to ask, you were saying about holding our payment at 7/10, Senator?
Yes.
I didn't know if you wanted us to address that. John McGarry-Otis, who runs our Division of Pension and Benefit, can just weigh in on what the potential effect would be of that.
I'd like that, and to know the number. So I
don't know if you have that.
I realize I can't just take last year's number, divide it by 7, and add it. So what is the number? I think it's around $700 million is to get us from 7/10 to 8/10. But I'd like to, if you have that number.
On what the projected annual growth is, to the extent that you lower the contribution to 7/10 from 8/10, it will increase contributions in the future by increasing the unfunded liability, which ends up being amortized at the current rate of return of the system, which is 7.3%. It will be lowered to 7%, but to that extent, you're going to create additional long-term debt by lowering the contribution that will be paid back at a higher interest rate.
Fair enough, although the question really is, I think, what you're paying on the borrowing in order to make that. Because if we borrow the money to make the payment, we pay interest on that long term, right? So we're not losing 7%, we're losing whatever the difference is, maybe. And if you take the money, invest it in the market, and the market goes down, then you've actually diminished the value of the principal that you put in, which gets me to another point. If we're borrowing money to put it into the pension system, which is going to the market, that's arbitrage, which is a pretty risky investment scheme that none of us should probably do. Maybe you guys, maybe you experts up with your own money, but none of us should be doing with public money.
Senator, if I could just address the differential, because I understand a couple of points you've made, but the one point I'd like to address is that, again, we would expect, if we enter the markets in the near term, to be able to finance the state's debt at roughly about a 2% interest rate, potentially a little below 2% if we're in the public capital markets. That would be for a 10-year term of issuance. That is obviously substantially below the 7.3% assumed rate of return on the pension today, which is what a failure to make the payment would accrue at on a going forward. So that's so substantial that it's hard to imagine that over a long term it wouldn't be beneficial to borrow in the public capital markets as opposed to pay that cost.
Fair enough. I will do that homework. Yes. There is